this was the rather deliberately provocative title for this seminar. Firstly, my main reflection is that I'm not sure I even agree with the first statement, which is obviously I can't imagine that an outstanding school is consistently outstanding in every lesson. Otherwise, you wouldn't be bringing in newly qualified teachers. So it's clearly inherent in that statement is the idea that you have to have a process that is embedded in the school for moving teachers on in their careers and moving them forward and progressing them. And then the second one was something that when I very first started working in this area, was very uncomfortable sharing with schools. There were so many vested interests in the traditional model of professional development that doors closed to me when I started talking about what the research was saying about traditional professional development methodologies. So I think now, however, I'm a little bit more comfortable talking about these things because there are two key ideas that I really feel their time has come within the education system. The first one is that the teacher is just central to the educational outcomes of young people, and that anything and everything we can do to provide them with the best possible learning experiences throughout their career is just, we've just got to do it. And the second one is that traditional models, as I've already explained, are quite flawed. But let me just move on to be a bit more specific about what I mean by the traditional models. So what we're really talking about are listening to lectures, being involved in presentations. I'm aware of the irony. However, the main issue with this sort of transmission-based model is that it decontextualizes the learning for the teacher. It doesn't link it to their specific needs, and it's something that's done to you, not by you. And from my perspective, I don't know, obviously everyone will have their own experiences, their own learning experiences throughout their careers and while they're at school. But if you're learning a skill, context is king. If you take the context away and you're trying to learn a skill in isolation, the barriers to enacting that skill do not exist in the training room. They exist in the classroom where you're trying to put them into practice, and it's there that you need to be doing the learning, and it's there that we need to be focusing the support. And so that's why when we were working at the University of Sussex, the use of video was so vital, because it kept teachers in the classroom. Head teachers were happy because it meant that they weren't having to pay so much cover teaching. More importantly, they were able to put the skills they were learning into practice in context. I liken it very much to trying to cook in somebody else's kitchen. I don't know who's ever done that. But when you're in a scenario where you just can't find that spatula, I don't know where it is, and if you're not in context, if you're not in your home context, it's very hard to put things into practice for the first time. And actually, it was just a reflection as well, and this is the last point, but obviously schools set their stall by becoming centres of excellence in pedagogy, but I would suggest that before we do that, we need to understand how adults learn and understand that that is different from the way that students learn. And we need to be integrating all that we know and learn about andragogy, adult learning, into the operation of the school before we even have a hope of being effective as a pedagogical institution. So I've picked 3 things here to demonstrate the impact of the traditional model of professional development. However, I could have drawn on 25 years worth of research in education, psychology, and I could have pulled numerous equivalent statements. If you remove the context and you depersonalise learning, then enactment, the extent to which you can put into practice what you've learned, goes through the floor. So the TDA research showing that 10% of CPD effectively embeds in practice is actually pretty generous. Joyce and Showers in the US and my colleague Sean Edmondson would probably agree through their research that it was between 0 and 5 and probably at the lower end of that. So there's an awful lot of money being spent on traditional methods and methodologies with what I would suggest is a fairly poor return on investment. So this is a really interesting thing, because when I was sort of saying you've got 20 years of education research showing this, you could actually go back a little bit further. There's some stuff from the 1950s in there. The question is, why? Why are we continuing to repeat models that are having very little impact? And I would suggest that the reason for that is it's the way that we assess our CPD input. So I remember when I was an interactive whiteboard trainer, I had a little evaluation questionnaire that I would hand out at the end, and it would start off with questions like, was the room comfortable? Was the food nice? Were you entertained? Or something similar. Do you feel like you learnt something? And then that was it. The questions didn't go on to say, did you manage to put into practice anything that you learned? And do you think the students learnt anything as a result of you putting into practice the thing that you learned? So unless we are evaluating on this higher level, it's virtually impossible for us to change a system. I think that was quite a nice quote from a guy called Gusky, who says that if your evaluation focuses on how nice the cookies were, all you'll end up with is nice cookies. So what are the alternatives? What else can we do? What else can we look at here? Well, there's quite a lot of educational theory around, and this one, this is actually a version of Dale's cone of experience, but it's pretty powerful and it's pretty explicit. It's saying that, broadly speaking, the extent that we enact and learn and enact skills is broadly proportional in terms of a cone here. So at the bottom, you are going to remember probably about 5% of what I'm saying today in time. And then towards the end of it, at the top of the scale, if you're teaching something, you definitely know it, right? You're asked to teach in a new subject area. You're going to invest the time and really get to know it in a level of detail that you wouldn't otherwise. But what's going on above the lectures and the reading section at the bottom here is what we call the experiential sphere. These are the things that we can do that engage with the really effective interactions that we know will lead to enactment. So those things are like being a coach or a mentor, sharing best practice, being involved in the community of learning, peer mentoring, iterative mentoring, self-review, and observing best practice. In fact, we can boil it down a little bit further. Oh, hang on, sorry. There's a mystery slide in there. This one I particularly like because this is the cone of experience alongside the distribution of learning opportunities in your average organisation. It's not a very good recipe for return on investment, is it? So I'm just going to move through and then just come back to that. That notion of sort of coaching and being involved in that kind of professional dialogue that you have around the lesson observation, that can be broken down effectively into modelling, observation and professional dialogue. And as I sort of said before, all of those, right at the centre of what you might define as a teacher's signature pedagogy, is the notion of lesson observation. So right in the middle there is lesson observation within a community of learning. But there are a few challenges with that. And this was one of the things that we noticed when we started working at the University of Sussex, is we noticed that as soon as you put an observer in the classroom, the dynamic of that lesson changed significantly. The children behaved differently, the teacher behaved very differently. And if you want a lot of people to have a shared experience of that lesson, and you put more than one person as an observer into that room, you may as well give up and go home. Everyone's going to be behaving so differently. It's a radical shift. The other issue with it is that it's quite a subjective experience. You're relying on somebody else to be able to observe and provide you with critical feedback, but you've got no shared evidence set for that dialogue. So what that can sometimes lead to is a little bit of conflict in the dialogue process, especially, I've just moved down to number 4 on that list, if the debrief is happening and the dialogue is happening quite some time after that original observation. 2 or 3 days later, you sit down and say, I think you asked quite a lot of closed questions in that lesson you gave 3 days ago. It's not going to engage people, and they're going to find it very, very hard to remember what you're saying. And the other one that I think is really important there is actually that you've got to free up somebody to come in and physically be in your room at the same time, which might involve cover teaching, and then you've got to free someone up again to have that dialogue and debrief process. So if you took the true cost of a lesson observation to include potentially the cost of cover teacher and the cost of freeing up your time, it's actually one of the most expensive things a school can do. And then finally, I guess the main thing I'm going to say about traditional models of lesson observation is that there is inevitably a dual purpose to the process, or at least the process is associated with a dual purposing. And all I'm going to say is that can undermine, unless it's very clearly distinguished, one of the most powerful learning interactions a teacher can have, which is peer coaching and peer mentoring. So what else can we throw into the mix alongside, engaging interactive activities that are focused around enactment and context? Well, the other thing is that you've actually you've got to be part of a process that the end point is the empowerment of the professional at the front line. So the idea that the teacher is involved in a community of practice and taking responsibility for their own personal development and the development of those around them. When you try and introduce, I'll just say we work with video. When you try and introduce video into that context, and there's any question of the duality of the use of this, is this video going to come back and bite me? Is it part of my performance management process? Then you quite often will find that people will shy away from it and not engage. And so what we're saying is we want teachers to be aware and in control of the use of video and use it to empower their practice and empower the social learning environment that they're in. And actually, I alluded to this a little earlier, actually, which is that empowerment being the end of a journey. I think it's quite fair to say that, as systemically, you've got to go from a position of control through development to empowerment, and staff are at different points in their career at different parts of that pathway. So as I come through, you can actually see that becomes a bit of a cycle. So this was us basically trying to capture as much as possible of what I've said in the last 10 minutes in a single diagram. And it's in your pack. But it's this idea that we can move through a cycle and we can come into that cycle at different points within our career. So for example, as an NQT, I may enter and require scaffolding, and those sort of, someone showing me how to do it, physically modelling how to manage a classroom, for example. And then I'll need coaching as I move through into a phase where I can actually start developing and taking responsibility via reflection and viewing my own lessons, and then finally moving through into a collaborative and contributory sphere where we're developing communities of practice and actually researching our profession. But the whole time, someone who's in the contributing phase is providing the modelling and the coaching for people who are at the scaffolding phase. And I think this was the insight that I had when we were looking at that original question, which was, if you're going to be an outstanding school, you've got to have outstanding teaching. Well, no, you need a model. You need something in there that you can say, no, this is how we move people on and progress them through the various different stages of their career.